Thank you. Appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be a speaker with such an outstanding group of other speakers. We'll talk about soil health, soil carbon, rangeland management, because I think those all fit together, and they always have. And that's one theme I want to focus on today is not to denigrate my cropland colleagues, but you know, we've been working on soil health and rangelands for 100 years, and it's nothing new to us. We just changed the names of a few things. But I want to start with some philosophy, and especially when you work in rangelands, and when you work in croplands or forests, you tend to make up for things with inputs. If something goes wrong, you increase your inputs. On rangelands, we don't get to do that, so we have to have philosophy to help us make decisions and to pacify ourselves when our decisions go bad. But I do want to start with this particular group. Now, also want to point out that this particular group of philosophers has always drawn heavily on things that they got from indigenous peoples, both Aboriginal indigenous peoples in Australia, North American First Nations. There was a lot of us around in the storytelling part and some in the written part, and these are just the people that have started really to write about it with a lot of output, and it's very accessible. So we start with John Muir, and Muir was the guy that founded national parks, or sort of came up with the idea politically, but all built around one idea that nature is essential for human health. So humans were inextricably tied to nature. Shortly after that, Aldo Leopold, many of us here in New Mexico know who Aldo Leopold is. I worked in the Gila National Forest. I noticed that his house is here in Albuquerque, and it's on the State Register of Historic Sites. So he actually lived in Albuquerque and wrote the Sand County Almanac. Really accessible piece of writing with a tremendous amount of insight. And he came up with the idea that humans and nature share community. They're all part of the same community. And then finally, he passed away in the late 1940s. A whole new crop of people has come along in the past couple of decades. I singled out Dr. Paul Thompson here, who is currently at Michigan State University. He's a Kellogg professor of environmental ethics. He's one of many, many people doing this sort of work right now. I only cite him because he taught me environmental ethics at Texas A&M in graduate school. And he talked a lot about reductionism versus holism. So what we've learned from environmental ethics and the work of all these people and what they drew out of those native and indigenous sources and what they have worked through the philosophy of is they're trying to separate one attribute of land health from the rest of it and attach a value to it, what we call commodification. Seldom works in complex socio-ecological systems. And you can find multitudes of examples of that, whether the attribute that we're trying to commodify is a commodity traded on the Chicago Board of Trade, or whether it's an emerging environmental service, or any of a host of those attributes. It just doesn't really work very well. So how do we link soil health, soil carbon, and ecosystem health that includes people? And I think Tom just gave a really nice overview of how he approaches it. Well, scientifically, we do it with the emerging field of ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are the total breadth of the values, the commodities, the goods, the services that we get from ecosystems. They can include certainly things like food and fiber. They can include climate regulation, storage of carbon in the soil. They can include watershed health, clean water. I think there's a list of about 25 or 30 from IPCC. But you know, that's our whole idea about what the context is and the philosophy for managing soil carbon and managing soil health. These things are just one of many ecosystem services. Like I said, Rangelands, we've been working on soil health for a long, long time. As early as the early 1940s, the Society of American Foresters defined rangeland condition as essentially health of the ecosystem, including the soil. In late 1940s, just about the time that Aldo Leopold was completing his life and leaving us Santa County Almanac, a new group of practitioners came along, among those E.J. Dijksterhuis, who was one of my mentors, came up with a way to measure range condition and measure the effect of management on range condition. Dike came up with some great ideas, great principles. The combination of climate and soil is referred to as the site. This is really important. If we have one theme in rangeland management, it's that site determines capacity and it determines response. So that's why we don't come up with rules. We have principles. Many kinds of vegetation can occur on that site. We just saw those pictures. The mixture of vegetation determines the condition. Condition is the ability of soil and plant to function. That's what we define as health. Range condition is rangeland health. And it allows for the application of broad ecological principles to specific land units. And that's kind of been the basis of rangeland management for almost 100 years now. Take these broad ecological principles and get those down onto that piece of ground, that fence line contrast. We can look at those principles across those fence lines and say, okay, we think we know what's going on here, and more importantly, we think we have an idea about how to fix it. Unfortunately, Dike at the time subscribed to the prevailing theory in ecology, which was the climax plant community, and that was all tied up with a philosophy that kind of went off the rails, that there was a logical endpoint to all this, and there was only one community that was the best. And more time to look at these things in more different circumstances and different places kind of has led us to reject it. So we've now come up with a reiteration of rangeland health. Starting in the mid-90s, a National Institute of Science report on rangeland health turned out a really great, short, well-written, easy-to-understand book that said, okay, we have multiple plant communities on the same site. And where previously range condition had always been about, well, okay, this plant community is better than that plant community. We have a number that goes with it. If we're not up to that number, then we need to get that number up there. Well, in this one, they all have value. They all have different values. Some may be more valuable than others in the current circumstances, but they all have values, and we can measure those values. And we also have thresholds. And thresholds are really an important part of the principles by which we manage this land. And that is, once something crosses a threshold, to use the scientific term, you're going to play hell getting it back. in a management context. So it's important to manage to avoid undesirable outcomes, and then when you do have an undesirable outcome, you need to account for how long and how it's going to take you to get back and how much time it's going to take. Again, very strong emphasis on site as the basis. Different sites have different potential and they have different responses. So then now, some of my colleagues, especially at the Ornata, have actually come up with the principles and techniques for measuring rangeland health. They've got workbooks, they've got fact sheets, they've got little calculation sheets. You can go to the field, measure 17 different indicators in a worksheet, and come up with an estimation of rangeland health. So, I mean, we've actually turned this into a thing that we can measure. Okay, so that's kind of the ecosystem health part of it, of which soil health is one part, and of which soil carbon is one part. Couple of questions that we have to really deal with in the context of this workshop. Some of those relationships is, does soil carbon equal soil health? We think it does, we hope it does, but we're not there yet. We're lagging. In particular, the conceptual and mathematical relationships. If you look at this diagram here, this is a kind of a biology, chemistry, physical measurement triangle, and the green is biology, the blue is physical, and the brown is chemical. Most of these measurement techniques that we have are chemical. So that's kind of what we've tended toward trying to quantify soil health with some sort of chemical measurement. And we've developed a few more as we get more back into the center of that triangle, but in general, they line up along that axis on the right there, meaning that we typically take these things, we take a sample, we move it into the lab, and we take some sort of chemical measurement that after the soil has been processed. We're very heavily weighted there. So even in the end, if we get back over in the middle of that triangle, how are we going to measure it? Now, if we take carbon markets, if we take private sector money for our soil carbon, how are we going to guarantee that we can deliver it? We're not going to put it on the grocery shelf. If we take taxpayers' money for programs to improve soil health and increase soil carbon, how are we as state government employees, federal government employees going to show the taxpayers that they've invested that money wisely? So how are we going to measure that? Okay, this is the fourth or fifth time you've seen this, I think, these next two slides. But they're really important in rangelands because, like I said, we don't get inputs. We don't get to put fossil fuels into our system. But in general, long-term storage of carbon is an outcome of photosynthesis, humidification, aggregation, and ultimately respiration. Exposing carbon compounds to the atmosphere releases CO2. We have three forms. You've heard about those today. The short form, the annual particulate organic matter, the medium form, mineral-associated organic matter, and then long-term soil and organic carbon. But in general, we tend to focus on this side of the equation, the inputs. We know a lot about photosynthesis. The only way that carbon is going to get into the soil via photosynthesis is through those roots. You can have those plants die over all you want, but you have any idea how hard you're going to have to stomp on dead plant material to get it into the soil, more than a centimeter deep? If you think that's easy, you've never dug a post hole. That death and decay and translocation of the roots, death and decay of those roots. And then humification and aggregation. Really important. And I'm going to, actually, the next slide I'll go into that in microscopic detail. And then finally on the other end is decomposition and respiration. How many of you have had biochemistry? College level biochemistry, okay. If you remember, you spent maybe one lecture on photosynthesis. How long did you spend on respiration? Spent 2 or 3 weeks on respiration. And that gives you some idea of the relative importance of these in that system. This is building it up, and this is tearing it down. Okay, like I said, you've seen this one before in some other form today, but I go with this one because, number one, it's from a 1960 textbook, which sort of goes to show, yeah, we've known this for 70 years now. So we start over here with clay platelets. Remember clay platelets. That's important. That bacterial debris, those dead microbes start to form around those clay platelets. Then we actually get up to a 0.02 millimeter aggregate. And that's why the measurements like aggregate stability and bulk density are so important as indicators of soil health. Is the quality, the amount and the quality, the stability of those aggregates really important in terms of, number one, locking up soil. That protects soil from being attacked by the microbes that then respire. Those small aggregates get mixed with hyphae from the roots and often interact there. And then we start to actually get up to a 2 millimeter chrome. That's kind of that's where we all want to go. We get those 2 millimeter chromes in the soil. Okay, a little bit about measurement of all these properties. Physical, chemical, biological, whatever. Measuring things in the field is so difficult that it's, outside of the research setting, it's impossible. And that's just physically. If you start to add in the cost, it's ridiculously prohibitive. This is a study from northern Michigan, Kellogg Biological Station. In the 90s, this field is about 100 acres, 110 acres. It had been farmed for over 100 years, clean tilled, maximum soil disturbance, maximum soil mixing. So if there ever was a homogeneous field, you would think that's what this is going to be. There's the map of the soil carbon distribution based on those measurements. So the measurements points are here. There's the map that was created in terms of soil. It's a factor of 3 in less than a meter. Now, if you want to figure out how much money it's going to cost you to measure this at some level of statistical reliability, again, you know, if we tell somebody we're increasing soil carbon, we really ought to, at least theoretically, have a way to prove it. So we get down here to look at this semi-variogram, and that's an estimate of the variance, and the part of that variance that tries to tell us whether we're underestimating the amount of carbon in the soil or not. We don't want to underestimate it. And you can see that, boy, if you want to get, you know, a good estimate, you're going to need 40 samples in that 100-acre field. After that, you'll gain a lot, but until then, you got pretty much a 50-50 chance of being outside the bounds of acceptability. But we're not going to take that many measurements. Essentially, we're going to model this stuff. We're going to take a few places like this, measure the heck out of it, take these kind of equations, and then put those into models and then measure it. Or predict it using a model. Okay, measurement, we're not going to measure directly. We're going to model. It's difficult. What matters? We talk about the effects of grazing intensity in the tall grass prairie. Grazing intensity here, I'm particularly going to contrast heavy continuous, multi-paddock, and explosion. So nothing there. This is from a paper done by Richard Teague and colleagues from Texas A&M in 2011, I think, up in northeast Texas, 35, 40 inches of precip. These areas have been managed this way for 30 years. The only difference that we saw in soil carbon was on heavy continuous. Now, heavy continuous, I've been doing this for a long time in a lot of places. I have never heard anybody prescribe heavy continuous grazing. So, that's not good. No matter what you're looking for, that's not good. And the same thing down here, a host of soil properties, a host of biological, physical, and chemical soil properties in that table down below. We looked at those same three categories there. Places that had been managed differently for 30 years. And we didn't see any differences attributable to grazing management in those 35 or 40 inch rainfall areas. This one's just come out. Don't try to read anything on there. The only thing you need to look at really is there's 25 variables down the left side that were measured on moderate, no grazing, moderate grazing, and ultra high density grazing. Moderate, no grazing, and ultra high density grazing. And the only thing that came up different were those two things. One of those is zinc. I don't think anybody knows what that means. Maybe a good soil chemist would. Again, just no response in the short term. Short to medium term, anywhere from multiple years to decades. Look a little bit closer to home in Las Cruces on the Jornada experimental range. We worked on a clay ecological site. So this is in terms of soil carbon sequestration. Clay is about the best soil texture you can have. This is on the highest clay soil that we have in that part of the world. Using the state transition model here, the blue state is Tobosa grass. The red is burrow grass. We saw higher levels of soil carbon in the Tobosa grass, in the upper 10 centimeters. But when you got down below that, you didn't really see much difference. Now, it takes 50 years to get a vegetation transition like this. These are run-on areas. Typically, they were cut for hay. And when hay became easier to get to, they stopped cutting for hay, and they were kind of overgrazed during drought. And they're run-on areas, so they usually have pretty good cover. They also have a lot of clay and probably not a lot of soil erosion. But it took us 50 years to actually induce a transition. And that's normally not a good transition. We don't like to see that burrow grass displacing it. And if you'll notice there in that state transition model, we're really uncertain about how to go back. So it took 50 years to get this. We don't know if we can go back. And one other confounding factor is that even though these were on the same soil map unit, the finest delineation of soil properties that we have for managing agricultural land, these were the same soil. Yet that site that went to burrow grass had much less clay in it. Of all those samples, you see that red line on that on the triangle on the left there, there's a lot more clay in those soils, in those samples. So, was it the clay or was it the management? Well, some other folks asked that same question and kind of came up with this one. This figure is out of Arizona. Recently, those bold lines there describe the effect of texture, soil texture, particularly clay, on soil carbon. And in both cases, both inorganic carbon and organic carbon, the content, clay content of the soil accounts for about 80% of the variability. Now, what that means is there's not a lot left over to account for. Dr. Justin Turner at Wyoming did the same thing on a bunch of plots in that mixed grass prairie in the northern plains, and came up with the same conclusion that it's about 90% due to clay. The carbon sequestration content and sequestration capacity is about 90% due to the amount of clay in the soil. So clay is really important. And from a management standpoint, if you're trying to increase soil carbon, you work on the clay sites first. And if you're going to measure it, try to measure it there. Don't be surprised if you go to a sandy site, try to measure it, you're not going to see any response. These are soil carbon, carbon dioxide flux measured with super sensitive towers, about 30 or 40 feet high, spread out in 8 different locations around on rangelands in the central and southwest U.S. Very sensitive to carbon fluxes and very expensive to build and maintain. And they sample about 1 hectare of ground. They integrate over 1 hectare of ground. These are called eddy correlation or eddy flux towers. Very, very precise estimates. They did that over 6 to 8 years, depending on the location. And what we saw was that here in the southwest, Las Cruces, Walnut Gulch, Lucky Hills, both over by Tucson, those sites are losing carbon almost every year. And where we saw that those yearly losses, what we saw was that was when it didn't rain. If it rained, we got soil carbon sequestration. If it didn't rain, we got soil loss. So in that case, just like almost everything else in the desert, water is driving. Wow.
Water is driving.
And we see those same relationships in other places as well across the central U.S. Nunn, Colorado is shortgrass, classic shortgrass prairie. Woodward, Oklahoma is mixed grass, tall grass, transition zone. Mandan, North Dakota, northern plains, prairie. Temple, Texas, probably the best site on here, 30, 35 inches of rain a year. Even that site only sequestered carbon 3 years out of 6. And they had some extremely high rates there, almost 5 tons per acre per year. That was just after they burned it. So they got a really good rainfall year. So this is driven almost exclusively by rainfall. And, in many of these situations, these soils and these sites are losing carbon, up to 5% of their carbon in any given year, just based strictly on rainfall and how that affects production. And it doesn't seem to matter what part of the world you're in. That's a principle. Rainfall sequesters carbon, drought loses carbon. We can manage around that one, but along with clay, that's the 2 big controlling factors. Okay, what matters? Well, first of all, soil texture. Soil texture is what defines the potential. You are just not going to have as much potential on a sandy site or a loamy site as you are on a clay site. Long-term climate matters. Obviously, if you live in a tall grass prairie, you've got a lot more opportunity to sequester carbon because the rainfall is a lot higher and a lot more reliable. Vegetation change matters, particularly shrubs and grasses, or like I showed you on that example from the Ornata, just changes in grasses can matter. But these things, soil texture, realistically is never going to change. We looked at that figure of that field in northern Michigan that had been plowed for 100 years, and it didn't really look like they had changed soil texture or landscape position. Long-term climate, short-term weather, we've got very little control over those as individual managers. Vegetation change matters. We got some control over that, but like I said, if you're going to get a vegetation change on an ecological site on rangeland, it's going to take you decades, if not centuries. I think Tom's example of brush control being in the 40, 50-year category is a really good example. Grazing management doesn't seem to matter that much, except for situations where there's degradation, when you see soil degradation, and that refers to soil movement. The soil profile is disrupted, soil is moved, like the dunes down in southern New Mexico and those sand dunes down there. And avoid soils. So we kind of come back to this idea that, okay, all of these sites out there have different potential and they all have different values. Some recent work out of California where they looked at the same soil, same site, occupied either by oak savanna, oak woodland, or grassland. And the way they got this was that area was almost exclusively covered by woodlands, oak woodlands, and in the post-World War II, there was a lot of effort on reducing oak cover or completely clearing the oaks and creating a grassland. And what they went in and measured a bunch of soil properties and looked at the ecosystem services associated with those different plant communities on the same soil. And you can see that, in the grassland soil, you're going to get higher agricultural production because you're going to grow more forage, especially on those annual grasslands. But your soil health suffers, soil carbon suffers. On the oak savanna, just where the oaks are thin, a little bit more equitable distribution among the different categories of ecosystem services. But when you get to the woodlands, agricultural production goes very low, but soil properties, biodiversity is very high, watershed values are very high. It just depends on what the value of those particular plant communities are at the time when somebody wants to buy them. But I kind of begin summarizing this. And I didn't talk a lot about this, about shrub increase. It's sad, but true. So, carbon is higher on shrub-invaded rangelands than it is on grasslands. And unless you get this massive degradation. Shrubs have more extensive root systems. They exploit soil moisture in places that grasses don't get to. They're far more extensive. They store above ground carbon. It's a little more vulnerable to fire at that point, but if you look at the data, we're, increasing shrubs is increasing, in general, increasing ecosystem and soil carbon. Unfortunately, it means giving away a lot of values that we have in rangeland. Biodiversity, open space, hydrology. So, again, it's a trade-off. Well managed is probably going to stay pretty even. They're at equilibrium. They are always trying to get to equilibrium. That line is going to go up and down, plus or minus 5 or 10%, maybe in any given year, but it's always going to trend around that same line as long as the land, the soil properties and the vegetation on it are stable, that soil carbon is going to be stable. If we do restoration, depending on where you are, it's going to take you 50 years. In some places, we don't really even know, number one, how long it's going to take, or number two, what to do. So if we undertake to try to restore or increase soil carbon in a degraded rangeland by changing the ecological state of that particular piece of rangeland, you're looking at a 50, 60, maybe 100-year investment. And that means paying attention for that long. Degradation without soil disturbance, it'll come to equilibrium. It's probably just going to sit there. And degradation with soil disturbance is going to drop and really no way to get back. So, those five categories, there's actually a pretty good way to categorize rangeland health. And if you look at the rangeland health guides that we have, the worksheets, all of the things that we go through, they come up with a classification system that looks very close to that. So doing rangeland health is probably going to tell you, number one, what level of soil carbon you have there now. Number two, how risky is it, given climate change, given management changes, all the things that could happen. What's the vulnerability of that soil carbon pool to loss? And importantly, number three is what's it going to take to get it back if we decide we want it back. And never forget that in any given year, you're going to see a plus or minus 5% change, just due to the weather patterns. And we've even seen places and periods when we'd see 3 or 4 years of above average rainfall, and then in that fourth year we'd get a little below those 3 years, but still above average, and we see carbon loss. So it's the pattern as much as the amount. Okay, so summarizing, I have time to summarize, don't I? Okay. Soil carbon, mostly controlled by soil texture, driven by long-term climate and short-term weather patterns, primarily precipitation, but I think increasingly temperature, as soil moisture and temperature drive respiration. Grazing management, within that broad range of good management, doesn't really have that much of an effect, especially in the short term. Soil carbon is not a good basis for management decisions. In the short term or the medium term, it's good. We all want more of it and all that, but it's just not a good basis for management decisions. Soil health. Rangeland soil health has been around for 100 years. We're pretty good at it. It includes a lot of different properties, a lot of different types of measurements, but it's very hard to measure. And it's very hard, especially to measure at a level of precision that will allow you to compare moderate changes in treatment over a short period of time. Most of the work that I've done and most of the work that most of my colleagues have done, if you want to know what soil carbon levels are, look at the vegetation. That's probably the best predictor that you've got of soil carbon, is what's the vegetation is there on the type of soil that you have. So if you know site, and you know ecological state, you're going to know 90% of what you need to know about soil carbon. It's consistent with good management. It doesn't drive good management, but it's a correlation with good management. Rangeland management, we know the principles. Get the stocking rate right. get the distribution right, get the right animal out there and graze in the right season. How many of you have had introduction to range management? Oh, no. That's bad. Well, okay, if you remember, that was in the third week of introduction to range management, those 4 principles. So that's that's our bread and butter. We know those things. I'll talk a little bit about carbon offset markets. I've worked in those for the last 25 years. Management for soil carbon on rangelands is highly uncertain. And I don't feel like I'm overstepping my bounds based on previous presentations to say it's pretty uncertain on cropland as well. I mean, we know what's important, we know the general drivers, but to try to predict what's going to happen over 5 years, really, really difficult. That uncertainty, and it's real. It's not, it's not that we don't know how to measure it or anything else. That uncertainty is real. It's in the weather, it's in the soil. That equals risk. And good managers always know how to manage risk. I guess you could say bad managers don't know how to manage risk, but if you don't know how to manage risk, you're not even a manager anymore. So, and I think that anybody that wants to participate in these things or work in these markets, these offset markets, you have to ask yourself, who owns the risk? And in general, in the kind of economy that we live in, the people that take the risk make the money or lose the money. You need to know who owns that risk. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.